Have you ever struggled with overflowing elements or weird resizing behavior in CSS and you just want to be able to create these awesome responsive layouts? Well, then let me tell you, today I have something really special for you. I did some research to find out what is the best piece of information we can teach you in CSS. And here it is, a complete CSS Flexbox course. I know from experience that understanding Flexbox will get you to a level of superior understanding of how things work in CSS. When I first heard about it years ago, it completely changed the way I approach coding in CSS. It will enable you to create beautiful and responsive layouts in any imaginable way. You're going to feel so much more confident when approaching typical CSS problems like how to center a div or how can I make my website responsive with just a few lines of code. It all starts with HTML, where you have to define a reference point. This could be the body or a specific container that you use for your layout. Every HTML element that holds any type of content can be a Flexbox or grid container. Our first goal is finding out how to align elements anywhere inside its parent element. At the top, bottom, left, right, center, and every combination in between. So we are going to answer the most popular beginner question, how to center a div. In HTML, we have these 5 div container boxes. They have some very basic styles in CSS. To align your boxes with a Flexbox layout, you need to address the parent element. So we address the body and apply display flex. Notice how this immediately changed the way the boxes are positioned. They used to be one below the other, and now they are side by side. The display property is a very important CSS property. Most elements have a display of block or inline per default. Block elements take up the entire width of the screen. This results in elements being forced to the next line. When we apply display flex, we leave this system behind and enter a new world. Here, things work differently. Let's add a little border so that we can see the frame of our Flexbox layout. The most important concepts in Flexbox are the axes along which items are positioned, the main axis and the cross axis. They control the flow of our Flexbox layout. To position your elements, you have to keep both of these axes in mind. Don't worry, I will keep showing them every once in a while. To position your elements anywhere along the main axis, you need the justify content property. This property has 3 basic values. Flex start is at the start of the main axis. This is the default value, which is why our boxes are here at the left side of our screen. Flex end is at the end of the main axis. This will align the boxes on the right side. And center is at the center of the main axis. So you can use these 2 lines of code, display flex and justify content center, to center your elements horizontally. By the way, this video is a free sample of our HTML and CSS complete course, so if you like the way we teach and you want to learn more about web development, then get the full course right now. Now let's see how we can align elements vertically. In this case, we need to consider the cross axis. To do this, let's increase the size of the Flexbox layout by applying a min height of 800 pixels in the body. Now we can see that this black border is basically the frame of our Flexbox layout. To center your elements on the cross axis, we use the align items property. This property can have the same values as justify content. So you have flex start for top positioning, meaning at the start of the cross axis, flex end for bottom positioning, now they are down here, and of course center to put them in the center. And now we have finally answered how to center a div. You just need these 3 lines of code to center elements along the main and cross axis. Since Flexbox is flexible, this layout will work even if we change the size of the layout. The boxes will always be in the center, no matter if we change the height and width of the body. But justify content and align items can have 3 additional and more complex values: space between, space around, and space evenly. Space between will distribute the elements from left to right. The first and last element will touch the edge of the layout. Depending on how big the container is, the elements will have a bigger gap in between. Space around works similarly. But here the first and last element do not touch the edge. Instead, every element gets some space to the left and right. As you can see, even when I resize the entire website, the spacing between the elements adjusts automatically. But here we run into a slight inconsistency that just triggers my OCD. Since the right space of the box adds up with the left space of the second box, it will result in these spaces being twice as big as the spaces that we have to the edges. If you don't want that, you can use space evenly. Here all the spaces are the same size. And now finally the gaps are perfectly balanced, as all things should be. And of course, all of these values are completely flexible. They adjust perfectly when the size of the container changes. And that's the whole point of using Flexbox. Theoretically, you could achieve the same thing centering a div and positioning your elements using only margins and padding, but they are just not as flexible as a Flexbox layout. By the way, you can use the same values on the align-items property as well. But in this case, it wouldn't make sense, since we only have one row of content. The boxes will all just be at the start of the cross-axis. But it is possible to use these values on the cross-axis, as you will learn later once the layouts get more complex. For now, let's learn about another interesting Flexbox property, which is flex direction. To understand it easier, let's remove align items and just use justify content flex start for now. The flex direction property controls the direction of the main axis. Its default value is row, which makes the main axis go from left to right. You could also use row reverse to make it go from right to left. Looking at the numbers, we can see that it starts counting from the right. But this property also changed the way our justify content value works. Now, as the main axis goes from right to left, the value flex start is on the right side, and flex end is on the left side. You can also make the main axis go from top to bottom by applying flex direction column. Now the elements are no longer side by side, but instead on top of each other. Since the direction of the main axis changed, the direction of the cross axis changed as well. Now if you want to center these boxes horizontally, you no longer use justify content, but instead align items. Since justify content aligns the elements on the main axis, which goes from top to bottom, it doesn't make sense now to use it. We need to use align items center to center them on the cross axis. So I hope you understand that it is really important to remember the flex direction of your layout, as this completely changes the way all the other properties work. Per default, Flexbox uses a flex direction row. This will align the elements side by side. But you're also going to want to change it to flex direction column when you want your elements to be aligned vertically. Here is a very common use case scenario. You want your entire website to stay the same, everything is aligned vertically, but you also want to center everything horizontally. Then you would go to the body and apply display flex, flex direction column, and align items center. And with that, every element will automatically be centered horizontally. Alright, let's get back to our starting point, display flex. There are a few more simple Flexbox properties before it gets complicated. The gap property will create a gap between our items. This property is very simple and you no longer need to use margins inside a Flexbox layout. For example, let's give our boxes a gap of 20 pixels. And as we can see, now every box has a nice little gap in between. The flex wrap property can make your Flexbox layout responsive using only one line of code. You either have wrap or no wrap. If you use flex wrap, you will get a responsive layout that will align your items on the next line if we don't have enough space. Resizing the window will show how the elements flow to the next line when necessary. If you use flex wrap no wrap, that will not happen, and instead the boxes will shrink together. Using a flex wrap of wrap will make the elements flow to the next line. If we want this layout to be centered using justify content center and align item center, we end up with this layout. Why the gap between the first line and the second line is so big will become clear once we have a few more boxes. So let's say we have 9 boxes in HTML. Just add a few boxes and number them properly. Then the Flexbox layout will have more line breaks when we use flex wrap. The issue that we are running into is that we no longer have one main axis and one cross axis, but every line has its own main and cross axis. In this case, we have 3 of them. The align items property will only control the alignment along each individual cross axis. Flex start puts the boxes at the start of each cross axis. Flex end at the end, and center in the center. But now we also need another CSS property to control the alignment of all the lines together. For that, we use align content. Align content has a default value of space around, and this is why the gaps between the lines are so big. We can also apply space between or space evenly to change that. And of course, we can also use the basic values flex start, flex end, and center. So the difference between align content and align items is align items will control the alignment along the cross-axis of every Flexbox line individually, and align content will control the alignment of all lines together. Ultimately, the perfectly centered layout in Flexbox is when you center all three of these properties and wrap the elements automatically when necessary. Justify content center, align item center, and align content center. By the way, when we have a layout like this, where there are horizontal gaps and vertical gaps, then you can actually split the gap property into two different properties: row gap and column gap. You can use these to apply different values for the horizontal and vertical gaps. Let's say column gap is 10 pixels and row gap is 20 pixels. This way we applied different values for the horizontal and vertical gaps. But most likely you will not need that, and just use the normal gap property to control both at the same time. These properties are not so important on Flexbox, but they will become interesting when you have more complex layouts in Grid later in the course. By now, you should have a good understanding of alignment on Flexbox. Using these Flexbox properties and their different combinations of values, you can create any alignment possibility you want. And of course, if you don't know by now, you can also use Flexbox in every other HTML element as well. It does not have to be the body. For example, a little thinking exercise for beginners. If we want to center the numbers inside the boxes, which are currently at the top left corner, how would you do that? How can you center the numbers inside the boxes? Pause the video and try it out yourself. The answer is pretty straightforward. We do the same thing as earlier, but now inside the box selector. Display Flex to enable Flexbox. Justify content center for the main axis and align item center for the cross axis. And this way we centered the numbers inside the boxes. Obviously, you can use all the different combinations we talked about with flex start and flex end here as well. Now let's move on to something very powerful in Flexbox. You don't always have to wrap elements in Flexbox. You can also resize them responsively. So, our next goal is this layout where the boxes grow and shrink responsively. To do that, let's go back to our layout of 5 boxes in HTML. So remove a few boxes so that we have 5 boxes again. In CSS, we remove any Flexbox properties except display flex and gap of 10 pixels. This is as simple as it gets. Now, since we have no flex wrap applied, the boxes will be resized automatically if the viewport gets too small. This behavior can be specified using flex shrink. And interestingly, this is something that you apply on the flex items, not on the flex container. Inside the boxes, we can apply a flex shrink of 0, for example. This will prevent the shrinking of the boxes. They can no longer be resized and will overflow the container. This is also the case for every non-Flexbox layout. When you have the problem of overflowing elements like this, then consider using Flexbox to either wrap the elements to the next line or enable flex shrink with a value of 1 to make them shrink automatically. But remember, flex shrink of 1 is the default value. You can imagine this property like a switch that you can turn on and off. Now, when we have flex shrink applied, we can see how the boxes resize automatically. Currently, we are addressing every box the same way, using their class. So every box has the same flex shrink value. But you can also use different flex shrink values on each item. So, in HTML, I give the first box an ID, box 1. I want to style this one differently. When I address this box in CSS, I could give this box a flex shrink of 0, for example. And the other ones still have a flex shrink of 1. This will result in this behavior. Every element shrinks when necessary, except the first one. It will stay the same. You could use this intentionally if you don't want specific elements to shrink. For example, if you don't want to distort an image or icon, then it is pretty useful to disable flex shrink on that element. Now, flex shrink is pretty useful, but actually what I use way more often is its counterpart, FlexGrow. FlexGrow enables elements to grow, meaning to stretch along the main axis. Its default value is 0, so elements do not grow per default. But once you enable it, FlexGrow 1, all the flex items try to fill out the empty space inside their parent element. This means if there's more empty space, the elements will be bigger, they grow. FlexGrow tries to fill out all the available space inside the parent element. And of course, you can address specific elements and apply a different grow behavior. Let's say for the boxes, the FlexGrow is 0, so they cannot grow, but box number 1 can grow. And as you can see, we end up with this effect where only the first element will grow. I used this exact behavior when I developed the to-do application. Here, the to-do text grows as much as possible. while the checkbox, the delete button, and all the other elements should not be able to grow. This is a very useful technique to resize specific elements depending on the screen size, so you will use it very often when making a website responsive. FlexGrow and FlexShrink are not only a boolean that you can turn on and off, but they also work as a multiplier. You can assign even higher numbers than 1. They only make sense if they are compared with each other. For example, let's give the boxes a FlexGrow of 1 and the first box a FlexGrow of 5. Now, every element has the ability to grow, but the first one does it 5 times faster. This element will be bigger than the others, but every element can potentially grow. So you can basically apply different grow values to control how much of the empty space they should fill. This does not mean that this box is 5 times bigger. As we can see, per default, they are all the same size. But only when there's new empty space to fill out. Then this element will reserve 5 times more of that new space than the other elements. And the same thing can be done for FlexShrink. Now, the first box shrinks 5 times faster than the others. And of course, you can address every element on its own and apply a different value for FlexGrow and FlexShrink. But I never had a situation where this specific feature was being used, since most times you just want to turn on and off the grow and shrink ability for the elements in a balanced way, where they all behave the same way. This whole system of FlexGrow and FlexShrink becomes even more powerful when you combine it with minimum and maximum sizes, such as min width and max width. Because then you can define where the FlexShrink and FlexGrow should stop. You can say my boxes should be able to grow, FlexGrow of 1, but they should not become bigger than 300 pixels each, max width 300 pixels. Now the elements grow up to the point where they reach their maximum size. And the same for FlexShrink. They can shrink, but only until they reach a minimum width of, let's say, 100 pixels. This will make them shrink in the browser as expected, but once they reach that size of 100 pixels, the elements will overflow. And of course, overflowing elements is something that you should avoid. But sometimes your elements should not get any smaller and need a minimum width. To solve the overflowing problem, remember that earlier we talked about FlexWrap. We can't combine FlexShrink and FlexWrap by just using a media query. Normally, we use FlexShrink and FlexWrap is disabled with no wrap. But once the screen size gets too small and the min width causes the element to overflow, then we apply a FlexWrap of wrap, and the element wraps to the next line. And this is a beautiful example of how easy it can be to make your website responsive. You just use FlexShrink, and once you don't want it to shrink anymore, then you use a FlexWrap. A special feature of Flexbox that I don't really see that often being used is the AlignSelf property. This property works just as align items, but you use it on the flex items. That means, let's say we have an align items of flex start. And for some reason, we want to isolate the first box and apply something else that is not flex start. AlignSelf of flex end, for example. This will position only the first box at flex end and everything else stays flex start. Of course, center is also possible. So you can use this property to align self one item differently on the cross-axis. But unfortunately, I have not found a similar Flexbox property for the main axis. Let's say we have a general justified content of flex end, and we want the first item to be flex start. It's only logical to assume that the property justify self works the same for the main axis. But unfortunately it doesn't, since justify self is actually a property that you use in CSS Grid, as you are going to learn later in the course. If you want to achieve the desired layout, where only the first element is on the left side and every other element is on the right, then you would use the old school solution of margin right auto. This is a very useful technique for navigation bars. Here you want your company logo on the left side and everything else on the right side. So just use margin right auto. Now we already know a lot about CSS Flexbox layouts. But before we dive into grid layouts, let's summarize the key takeaways of Flexbox. You can position everything anywhere inside a Flex container if you consider the main and cross axis, and their properties justify content and align items. You can wrap elements to the next line using FlexWrap of wrap. You can also resize elements using FlexGrow and FlexShrink and apply different values for each element if that is what you want. Combining all of that with minimum and maximum sizes and media queries, you can already achieve most layouts that you have in mind. But if you want to create more complex layouts, or you just want to simplify your code, then let me introduce CSS Grid. Because there are actually things that are easier in Grid and work with even fewer lines of code. Here is a common situation. how to center a diff. An experienced Flexbox guy would say, just use display flex, justify content center, and align items center. And that's fine. But a grid layouts guy would say, hold on, 3 lines of code? I can do it in 2. Display grid, place content, center. Now, if you want to learn CSS Grid and Flexbox in a practical way, by building advanced projects like this landing page that uses modern Flexbox and grid sections, then I strongly recommend that you get our HTML and CSS complete course using the first link in the video description. My name is Fabian and this was Coding to Go, the channel where you learn the most relevant coding concepts in just a few minutes.